Hello, everyone. It's chapter 5 on Lucretius, Beyond Obsession and Disgust. Yes, we're still doing Therapy of Desire. I was just saying that when I took notes on this chapter, I seemed to think that everything was relevant. But it took me about halfway through the chapter probably to realize that it was really a book review. So it was slightly different from and I don't know, for some reason I didn't realize that straight away. What did you guys think?
It was very in depth. She really goes to great lengths to do the book review. Yes, indeed. It's comprehensive.
Yeah, it sounds quite interesting. I don't remember this. Never really been interested in Lucretius, but now I think it sounds like this might be worth a read. Last time we did this book, this chapter never really stuck out to me in any way.
I think now that you're married, it probably takes on a new resemblance, right?
Yeah, is that what it is? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I didn't read it. I blame being distracted by uni stuff and was reading statistics and it got lost. And then I sort of just remembered 30 minutes ago, oh yeah, the philosophy thing's on tonight.
All right.
Well, yeah, I think it's a lot more than a book review. In a sense, it's like it's almost a dissertation, addressing all the, she even goes through like the early medieval commentaries and stuff, that's like so technical. And yeah, just as with the Aristotle stuff, it's like she's gone through everything possible. And I think it's amazing, basically. It's an amazing chapter. So yeah, I do hope we can kind of get through most of it.
So a lot of it is that the impression. So this guy Clay wrote his position that he says she's saying that Venus becomes reduced to atoms, and most of this chapter is her saying no, it's not just atoms. There's still a humanistic element to it.
Yeah, like Judith says, she's venturing her own interpretation of the material, which seems to be different from mostly what's come before. And yeah, you're right, Judith. I mean, you read something like this and just think, wow, maybe if that was a book on its own, it would be impressive enough. But the whole book is like this, isn't it? She's incredible. I was reading it thinking, I just remember how infatuated I was with her last time. And, she really is incredible.
So she was like this deity, was she, Courtney? This.
Yeah, I think so. I really do. I'd say she's one of my favorite writers. Yeah, 100%. All right, let's jump in. So I'll summarize the first part. The poet Titus Lucretius was born, we are told by Jerome, also known as Big J, J-Dog, Daddy J, and Saint Jerome. We're told later on he went mad from drinking a love potion. That's Lucretius. The poet speaker claims to speak to us out of an intense personal experience of love, and that this same speaker allegedly, from the point of view of lucid rationality, condemns and assails love with a bitterness seldom equaled in poetry. But Jerome's story does not simply record these facts, it constructs a piece of biography to explain them. Make sure you guys just jump in and interrupt me whenever you think it's relevant, when you come across something you want to comment on. The madness of love was not an ordinary erotic experience. It was a compulsive state induced by a drug. And the condemnation of love can be seen as outpourings of bitterness and misery produced by an unwilling addict, rather than as rational criticism constructed through reflection by a free-thinking being. I've made a note here that here it seems love has the treatment of the other passions, that it distorts and has a tendency to get away from us and inflame our emotions. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, but may I also ask, was it through Jerome's biography that we get told about the fact that he drank the love potion? Does Lucretius ever tell us himself that he drank a love potion? Or is it just reported by Jerome?
I think it's just reported. And it's in this Christian polemical context. So basically, Epicureanism was the one ancient school that the Christians could not reach any accommodation with. So they could deal with the Platonists, they could deal with the Aristotelians, they could even deal with the Stoics, but they could not deal with the Epicureans, and that was because of the idea that there was no overarching providence, that it was just random atoms hitting each other, and so there's a real, I think she points out, there's a real polemical thrust here to make Lucretius seem ridiculous. I'd also note that it's kind of in a tradition, though, of, we see it in Diogenes Laertius, you know, the deaths of philosophers are often described as pretty ridiculous in one way or another. And so that's kind of this trope of the philosopher who takes himself so seriously, but then he dies a ridiculous death. So that's kind of a trope in the literature as well. And so Jerome seems to be ticking all those polemical boxes in this account of Lucretius' supposed death.
And it made me think too of there's a comment in Bertrand Russell's book on the history of philosophy that, and he's talking about the Stoics, but he says you can't help but ignore a kind of sense of bitter grapes in the cynicism of the Stoics, you know, in their deprecation of emotion. And you kind of get that feeling that Lucretius could be read that way, quite possibly, you know, that he's been on the wrong end of love and he's quite jaded by the experience of it. Did you guys feel like that could be something that other commentators would pick on? Obviously, Nussbaum's not going to, because she's going to take a more philosophical approach. Okay, so
it's just so very descriptive. It's just so fully descriptive that, you know, it's hard to ignore the fact that he's probably been there himself.
Yeah, and that gets repeated, doesn't it? That this is an experience that every reader is familiar with, not only through their own experience, but also because it's familiar to the textual genre of poetry, right?
Yeah.
So the poem has been read as poetic expression more frequently than philosophical argument, more frequently as irrational symptom than as rational therapy. So here Nussbaum argues that in this century, scholarship has begun to undo these wrongs with an interest in examining the poem's therapeutic and anti-religious purpose seriously. This is where Ashley was commenting on Disc and Clay. Now, I've just put one writer has convincingly argued that the poem is carefully crafted so as to lead an imagined reader through the process of Epicurean therapy step by step. In contrast to the past Christian-centered era, the progress towards acknowledging Lucretius is clearly connected with the prevalence in our time of secular and materialistic views of human life, accompanied by critical attitudes towards established religion. Lucretius' views about the world of nature and the soul now seem not mad, but eminently sane, far saner frequently than the views they were invented to replace. That's a really good point, isn't it? Because maybe in the Christian era it would have been quite almost heretical. Now it makes a lot of sense. Modern psychologists sometimes will talk about love in these sort of terms, evolutionary ones anyway. Do you want to make any comments about any of that?
Yeah, we don't. I don't know. He's just really ahead of his time here. I think this sort of stuff. It's kind of interesting about how backward and culty Epicurean is, but it's still so ahead of its time. Like with that element, it's so rational. What I thought was interesting thinking about this is how rational all this stuff is, and yet the Epicureans didn't teach logic at all. It's what's so interesting. Like, how did they realize all this stuff?
So then he says, the book says, so all assaults with the exception of one For love is widely revered. In fact, for many people, it has the status of secular religion. Okay, so she's commenting on modern sensibilities here in this section. So we can kind of take attacks on religion and what was the other one? Religion and the other popular thing that he was attacking, death, the afterlife, whatever. We're not shocked by any of that, but when we bring up love, we are, for love is widely revered, and people often prove far more willing to give up God or gods than to stop making gods of one another. I just think this is really, yeah, really powerful and obviously psychological. Love was religious even in Lucretius's religious time, as he himself tells us, a condition taken to be caused by a god, godlike in its power, linking the lover to a beloved who is appropriately seen as an embodied divinity. But in our time, when religious sources of individual salvation are widely mistrusted, personal erotic love, along with other secular sources of value, has become even more intensely to bear the weight of many people's longings for transcendence, for a perfection more than earthly, for mysterious union with that perfection. And non-religious contemporary readers who revere love may identify themselves with their erotic aims more fervently even than does Lucretius's imagined reader, since all the hope and desire which for that reader flows also toward heaven must for the contemporary reader be poured into fragile human and worldly projects. So Lucretius's assault on those projects threatens in a way that his other attacks no longer do. I think it's so interesting. I'm in a men's group, as I've told you many times before, and often the men will completely go on about, you know, how atheist they are and how they can't possibly be gods and things like that. Yet they all bang on about love and how important love is to them. And this made me think of that because it made me really think about how it has become an obsession for nearly everybody, and especially for people who felt they've failed in some way, in some deeply felt psychological way. They talk about how they used to love their wife and now they struggle to see her as the way they saw her when they were a teenager and things like that. It's like bang on. It's so spot on. What do you guys think?
So I actually did read up to this little bit quickly before we started, then I sort of gave up. There was two things. There was one, which is like there's someone who I watch and he half jokingly he does like I guess atheist content or debates sort of things. And he has his name's Pine Creek online, and he has the Pine Creek theorem, which is that more women have converted men to Christianity than any other argument or theological position, because it's a common theme that there'll be people coming on and it'll be like, oh yeah, I wasn't religious and then I married my wife who was a Christian and I converted, which I think is quite funny because it does, yeah, like that can be sort of that powerful thing. But I just find that sentence that like a separate point, and people often prefer far more willing to give up God or gods than to stop making gods of one another. That's just that sentence just feels so disconnected from my experience of love. Like I just have like, because I never had the like religious upbringing, I have a certain flexibility around what it means for something to be God or gods. And that's just not how I would describe my relationship. Like that, it just seems so, yeah, disconnected. So yeah, Connie, I'd be interested because it seems like you sort of more aligned with that.
Well, I mean, I would say, Shannon, that you know, people go into different relationships at different points in their lives. So the relationships that someone of 18 or 20 goes into are different from the relationships that someone of 27 or 35 goes into. So probably the obsessive erotic passion that is the subject here is maybe something that's a bit more experienced at a different stage of life than what you're kind of gesturing towards.
Yeah, but I've been with my wife for a long time. So it definitely had that stage. Like it's just never how I would, like, it just feels very disconnected from how I'd ever describe it. And like even like yeah, I don't know, it just doesn't it, it just seems like an odd comparison, I guess.
That's really interesting, Judith, though, that you say it makes you think of a more mature love, because I see this as a young love. Because when I was in, like, at the end of high school, I fell in love with this really hot chick, and I started writing love poetry, and it took me years to get over her because I had turned her into an idol, and I was worshiping that, and I never met a woman that ever came close to that image. It's exactly what he's written here. So yeah, and I think, where did it come from? And I can remember having these sort of very early romantic fantasies as a young, like even as a child, about fairies and, you know, Enid Blyton and all that sort of stuff, about that kind of magical world where the boy and the girl kind of run off in this magical faraway place together. And it was naive, but it had those elements already in it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because like maybe that's where our difference lies, because I've never had that, like what you described there. That's just not how I view people. Like I probably spoke about it before, but this whole idea of having not like a role model, I've always found that concept really strange. Even since I was like 7 or 8. And I used to tell old people, like adults, that I had a role model just to shut them up, because I was like, oh, this is what they want me to tell. But I guess I've just always held on to this idea that perhaps I wouldn't have worded it in this way, but like that people are human, like a very not low opinion, but not a high opinion of people. That's not to say there's like absolutely are people I respect, and like people whose expertise or virtues or such that I can be like, oh yeah, like that's really good. But it, like the way, and it's definitely not just yourself, Courtney. Like there's other people I've heard describe similar things that you're talking about now. I'm thinking about it, and that's just not how I view people. So maybe, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just a different experience or different way I'm wired.
Anyone else want to share a deeply personal and unsettling experience?
Well, I have to admit that, you know, my marriage, you know, which was early in my life, was very fraught, you know, very, very fraught with possessiveness and jealousy on both sides. And it was just so full on. And it was really, you know, it was really parallel, I think, to a lot of the things he talks about. Not everything, but certainly elements of it. Those negative sides of that possessiveness, that jealousy, that sort of expectations of the partner, and especially in those early years, you know, the teenage up to 30 or whatever, you know, just through the 20s, and you know, there was probably even elements of that, you know, even probably even after that. So I think it I don't know whether it's a female thing or a male thing, I really don't know, but yeah, I think I can relate comfortably to some of these things he's talking about in terms of the negative side of passionate love. Yeah, indeed.
Mm.
So here, Lucretius talks about the poems, right, as being the ones that are the allies of what does he call it? The God view of romance or something. But nowadays we have it's like it comes from romantic comedies.
Yeah,
So it's
but
interesting, isn't it?
Or pop music, I suppose.
Yeah, pop music, yeah.
Or yeah, movies. Or yeah, movies.
definitely pop music. I can remember when I feel ridiculous. I can remember when having these sentimental feelings and listening to really angry love music. How depressing.
But do you think, like, I mean, how much of this is in, if we went to a country where romantic movies and pop songs aren't about this sort of thing, right? Like, do people still have the same sort of attitude?
Well, I'm married to a Chinese woman and she wants me to dress like a K-pop star, you know. She buys me slender handbags and tiny wristwatches and begs me to please be more handsome, you know, this sort of stuff. So, of course, you know, definitely.
Nothing wrong with
But
good
are
role
these,
playing.
because this is, I mean, if we go somewhere, there cultures that aren't influenced by the mass media kind of thing, right? Like, what if we went to somewhere like Nigeria or something like, yeah, Bhutan or like a place like that? Like, because China's attitudes are still going to be influenced by whatever's in the media.
I think part of the question that you're kind of jumping ahead to, which I was curious about too, is why do we do this? And that I think comes up in a little bit when, because it all starts to sound very Freudian at one point to me. So let's go on a little bit and see what comes of it. So I've got a quote here from the text. From within religion, these anti-religious arguments look silly and mad rather than dangerous. So this is continuing on from what we were saying before. So much is true.
Sorry, Courtney, sorry to interrupt, but can you just tell me where you are in the text at the moment?
Page 143.
Thanks.
So much is true for the love arguments. To the lover of love, they can easily seem perverse and embarrassingly weak, creations of an embittered and despairing mind rather than rational proposals that we should seriously consider. Okay, so such readers read in short with the confident superiority of true believers who know already how wonderful erotic romantic love is and how impoverished a life without it. The voice that denounces it sounds like a mad voice, the voice not of a doctor, but of a patient. Okay. So Epicurean therapy aims at bad illusions that have been leading the Nikidian, in particular, in this case, into distress and error for years. Only that which threatens holds the promise of true therapy. And true therapy, as Epicurus insists, is painful. We must ask Nikidian and ask ourselves to take absolutely seriously the possibility that Lucretius is right, that erotic love, as most people know and live it, is bad for us, and that human life will be richer and better without it. In fact, Lucretius' arguments might be therapeutic, not in a nihilistic sense, but in a humane and constructive way. And this goes into what you're reflecting on there, Jody. They lead us not into an impoverished world, but into a world more richly human. They do this by exposing myths and delusions that constrain us and prevent us from dealing with one another in a fully human way. They lead us to a world beyond the religion of love, beyond the world's emotions of vain longing, of awe and obsession, of disgust with the body and its limits, into a world both natural and rational, not a world of colorless atoms, but a world in which we see and care for one another without religious interference as the very beings we are. I think that's so well said, hence I quoted it.
What page are you still on?
That's the bottom of 144 into 145.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I just point out here too, this is so, I mean, she's so brilliant, because this whole section where she explains what she's going to do, that's got a precedent in Roman poetry. Or Roman and Greek poetry actually. It's called a programmatic section, where the poet explains what they're going to do. So she's now got a programmatic section where she explains what her method is going to be. It's just so brilliant.
Love differs from other false beliefs and is learnt from poems and is itself constructed from poetic words. Through poetry and its stories, his reader learned its characteristic structures, its plot, its shades of feelings. And poetic love stories, once learned, serve the reader as paradigms to which actual experience is referred, on which it is modeled. So poetry against love will have to have a peculiar relation to its own traditions. It must turn poetry against itself, asking it to undo, using its own devices, some of its most cherished and alluring structures. that's the end of section 1. Does you want to say anything about that before to move to 2, or have we covered it? Did you take good notes, Jody or Judith? Or
I
anyone else?
yeah.
I'm happy
Yeah,
to
I've got some
share
notes,
it
but
around.
I've just written here, Lucretius, for Lucretius, love is the creation of poetic words, using plot and feeling. And so he uses poetry's own devices and traditions to dispute the value of love, how we value love, you know. Yeah, so that's just really just a summary sentence of what you just.
And as Ashley was saying, is she's sort of saying that, you know, and I think Plato has this idea too, that the poets have given us this idea of love that's not necessarily natural, and because we read about it, it shapes us in some way and gets into us.
Yeah. Well, even look, this is a big topic because, you know, I just adored fairy tales and even Barbie dolls and that whole thing with Barbie dolls and everything, like the doll culture for girls, and you know, just the romance, just even from childhood, and the Prince Charming, you know, every fairy tale had a happy ending, you know, and everyone lived happily ever after, and you know, that I really grew up on that. That I believed that stuff. It's just, but anyway.
I just wanted to draw attention very quickly on that page 145. She just says in passing, and this is so interesting, Lucretius tells us that Epicurus is a hero greater than any hero of legend, since he conquered no mere imaginary monster, but the real monsters that now tear human beings apart: vain longing, anxiety, fear, arrogance, and so on. Isn't that interesting and we saw that, I suppose, in the earlier chapter around Epicurus, how he was viewed in the cult, right? He's kind of viewed as a cult hero.
Yep.
And finally, she makes this point that poetry is going to be used against itself. But just to your point too, Jody, about fairy tales and a whole romantic tradition, you know, in the 18th and 19th centuries, novel reading was suspect because it gave young women unrealistic ideas about the world. So again, we've got this notion, again, as you said, Courtney, goes back to Plato, that fiction, whether it's poetry or prose, has the potential to give people an unrealistic idea of what their relationships are likely to look like.
That's great. Who wants to do number 2? I mean, I've got very comprehensive notes, but you guys probably don't want to listen to me all evening. So who goes next?
Well, I don't mind doing. I can take it through. I won't be too long to do section 2. It's quite short. I can jump into section 2. So basically, to write about erotic love, which point of view is acceptable, she's saying. So, you know, so which is reliable or appropriate. So as Epicurean therapy, to be against love is more difficult to convince than, say, for anger or fear of death, for example. Love is valued and seen as a good, and the gods of love were popular. So all the gods of that time of love were revered and very popular. But love is also associated with bad and negative experiences when it's lost. So therefore, you know, bringing pain. So later, it was seen as unworthy and repellent. I've got written here, later. Why did I write? Later seen as unworthy and repellent, delusion and fantasy. So Lucretius will bring us past both elation and disillusionment to genuine affection, using a couple of methods. One, a perspective of nature, and secondly, a perspective of from a societal point of view. So that first one, the perspective of nature, is basically in regarding our biology. So looking at us as biological creatures and the way we behave as biological creatures. And then secondly, as looking at it from the societal health, you know, how healthy society is and in promoting ideas of love. So Lucretius gives many perspectives and is not trying to force an alien view on us or impose behavioral conditioning, because he's basically providing us these many viewpoints. And Nussbaum says that he is basically fulfilling Aristotle's requirements of a thorough analysis. So, you know, again, we're seeing that, like Ashley said before, you know, wow, you know, they're really full on with their analysis. And that's true. She sees that as well, and comparing it to Aristotle, you know. So, yeah, he's really has been incredibly thorough and covering many viewpoints. And that was page 146, 147, and 148. There you go, 3 pages.
Very quick, Jodie.
Did you have anything else to say about that, Judith? Because there was something there.
I'll just go to page 147. And I think he covers what Nussbaum explains, that having sort of de-glamorized love, he points out that once the glamour of a love object has been removed, or something's changed in the relationship, the object often surprises by its banality. And I dare say in your experience, Courtney, where you had this fantasy or this exalted idea of a love object, once certain time passed and maybe certain events happened and that glamour was no longer present, often it seems very anticlimactic and very ordinary. So somehow love does impart for us that transformation, which then, once, for whatever reason, the love or the passion or the fantasy is removed or dissipated, then we're struck by the ordinariness of what remains.
Yeah, and sometimes, as he mentioned here, the opposite side of it. So disgust, even at discovering that your lover has an ordinary human body that expels waste, for example, and does things like that, things that goddesses don't do. But when you're talking to men in therapy who are having trouble in love, I think this is common enough, that they're really troubled by the fact that they no longer have this deep sense of love, this illusion of love for their partner, that she's become banal or ordinary. And they often reflect on it like it's a failure of them somehow, that there's something hardened in their heart or whatever, that they've become cynical and jaded. But the Lucretian view, of course, is, well, no, it just can't last because it's an illusion, you know. I think it's a much more sensible way and a therapeutic way to look at being with another person over time.
Would it be that it's like an illusion, or just that, you know, people can just grow apart over time? Like,
well, in this case, it's an illusion.
Yeah.
And that's something that might be pointed at a bit more directly, Jodie, is before he talks about the two perspectives, he mentions something important, I think, because it comes up again later. It's about the oppositions of the two ideas. So she says, given that most of us have experienced both extremes of love, its wonder and beauty on the one hand, and its enervating anxieties, and quite often its crushing grief and disillusionment and critical assessment, it's easy enough for us to understand love as a dangerous source of madness and constraint. We know that love brings pleasure and pain, and also it brings a shifting of perceptions. And the perspective that comes at the end of love has a way of vouching for itself as the sane or rational one, so that, of turning against the internal vision and attacking it as delusion and fantasy. And this idea of a double orientation is what Lucretius will imitate, giving its critique intuitive force by imitating this familiar movement in and out of love. And the bit I thought important here is his purpose is ultimately to move us beyond love's peculiar exaltation of its object and disillusionment's bitterness towards the object, to a perspective that, being constrained by neither of these, is free to perceive a partner clearly and with genuine affection. And later on, Nussbaum mentions how Nietzsche uses a similar strategy to say where you have perspectives that are have a polarity like this, you know, like good and evil, for example, like Nietzsche talks about, that they kind of distort the world in a way. I mean, maybe you can say more about that, but if we could get rid of those distinctions, we might be able to more clearly see the world as it is.
Yeah, and she notes that on page 148, I think it is, that what Lucretius is doing is in the Epicurean patient, or the reader in this case, is inspiring self-examination. And that's where, you know, even the Aristotelian critic might well be satisfied, as she says. I'm happy to go on to part 3 if that's okay.
Fire away.
Okay, well, I thought it was very interesting that she goes through what's left of Epicurus's own teachings on love and desire, and unfortunately, it seems as though he did write a major work called On Love, and he had a major work on nature and on atoms in the void, and of course, none of these survive, unfortunately. He had opinions concerning the passions against Timocrates. So we have little fragments in Diogenes Laertius, book 10, but you know, it's impossible to get a really thorough picture from those. On the other hand, we do seem to get a sense that Epicurus is pretty against love or erotic love per se. And so we've got this key doctrine. They believe, this is at the bottom of page 149, they believe, that's the Epicureans, believe that a wise man will not fall in love, eros tenai. Nor do they believe that love is something sent by the gods. And so this is something that we'll see Lucretius expands upon. The definition of eros is, quote, an intense suntonos, desire for intercourse accompanied by agony and distraction. And so this kind of contrasts very strongly with what the Stoics thought, who thought that sex was natural and everything natural was good. But Epicurus seems to have stressed the agonizing aspect of it. But there are sort of competing accounts as well. So we have, again, fragmentary accounts in Diogenes Laertius, this is on page 150, about female members of the garden, mammarion, which just means tits, hedea, that means pleasure, erotion, that means love, and nikirion. So are any of these names real? We don't know. And then there's Epicurus's own letter to a young man called Pisocles, which says, I shall sit here and wait for your divine and much longed for arrival. So he even uses the term divine. It sounds like he's actually doing what he might be criticizing other people for doing. And Epicurus stresses that in a famous fragment from On the End, I have no idea what I should consider good if I take away the pleasures of smell, take away the pleasures of sexual intercourse, aphrodision, take away the pleasures of sound, take away the pleasures of beautiful shapes. So that seems, he seems to have acknowledged sexual pleasure and other pleasures as central to the good, and of course that's what everyone knows from about the Epicureans. But at the same time, there's this opposition to sex, or sort of a faint praise attitude for it. And we see that on page 151. And the conclusion to that quote of that little fragment about sex there is, he says, for sexual intercourse never did any good, and it's lucky if it does no harm. So that kind of actually reminded me of St. Paul saying something like, you know, well, if you've got to get married, it's better to get married than to be just thinking about sex all the time. It's kind of like this very, very limited approval of actual relationships between the sexes. So just to conclude on that page, and I might just stop after that, but so this seems to indicate maybe. It's a bit speculative, but Nussbaum suggests that Epicurus places sexual desire in his system of classifying desires. And so remember, in the other chapter, we saw that there were empty desires for things like status or fine clothes and so on. But there are also natural desires, and they include desires for drink, food and drink. So it looks as though sex, or desire for sex, in that schema may sit in the natural but not necessary class of desires. So let me stop there and invite comment.
Yeah, well, they can be neglected without jeopardizing our happy, undisturbed condition. And we know that Epicurus's philosophy is aimed towards ataraxia, which is that undisturbed condition.
Yeah, and it's also got something there about, so sex is for only when it's prudent. I've written when it's prudent and unproblematic, and then I've written ha ha.
Fair enough. So just to go on, so that's the bottom of page 151. There's some evidence from the Scholia, that's the ancient commentaries, that this is in fact what how it was classified. It's a commentary actually on Aristotle. Gives the desire for intercourse as its example of the Epicurean natural but non-necessary class. To be just sidebar, I'm not sure how. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the acknowledgement that it was natural, it turns out to be key later on to Lucretia's account. Yeah, so it is considered to be natural, for what that's worth.
And linked to that then is, she says, but what turns this desire for intercourse into a dangerous, agonizing eros? The answer seems to be the influence of false belief. The transformation from natural, non-necessary desire introduces 1, strained or intense eagerness, and 2, an unsatisfiable, unlimited character. So Epicurus is saying that whenever you see these two characteristics in a desire with a natural basis, what you have on your hands is a hybrid, the corruption of a basic natural impulse at the hands of false belief. And erotic love is one of those corruptions.
Which page are you on there, Courtney? 150.
Must be right towards the end, because I just took notes. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, that was a good point.
So that's on page, Courtney's jumped ahead to page 153.
Can I, just before we jump forward, there's some really good big, she does some solid notes at the bottom of some of these pages, and they do give some rather good insight. So this one, she said at the bottom of page 152, possible corruption of the text on marriage and the wise man. So she felt that there might be an emendation made by some of the people that had translated, because it's some parts it says the wise man will not marry, but then it might have said the wise man will marry. So there was some confusion in the way it's been translated or something.
Yeah, so that's to do with Diogenes Laertius, and I've got my copy
okay.
here.
Yep.
Book 10, number 119.
Mm.
So the text as given here doesn't actually indicate any confusion, but that doesn't mean that there isn't any confusion, if you see what I mean. It might not have found its way into this edition. But so yeah, section 119 says kai mede kai gamesen kai techno poiesen ton sophon. So, and that seems, if there is a textual confusion there, I'm not quite sure where it would have come up, because it seems pretty clear. But yes, I take
Does it say something
point
about the wise man should marry, or the
in her note here she says this version, so one of the versions, omits the important word pote at some time on some occasion.
Have you met a wise man, Jody, and you're just wondering if he'll marry you or not?
No, it was just that it just seemed that she was bringing up this possibility that, where one text, one translation claimed that yes, the wise man said can marry or should marry, and then the other one that's sort of claiming that the wise man shouldn't marry. That was at the bottom.
Yeah, I don't know how. To be honest, I'm not sure how the reading that the wise man will marry could have come about, because I can't see that. So I just looking at the text, that I don't see that the negative. So there's a negative. So that if you look at that, the note 26 there, and she gives the transliteration to English. So the second word in that passage of the transliterated Greek is men. Now, men means not. So what I don't understand is how the man meaning not could have been omited from one version.
Thank you. No, thank you, Judith. Thank you. That's great. No, I appreciate it. It was confusing.
I mean, it may, she may have actually personally inspected the actual, surviving manuscripts. That's quite possible. But in the text that we have, there doesn't seem to be any doubt that he was opposed, or that he thought the wise man would not marry.
Okay.
You weren't asking for yourself, Jody. You were asking for a friend, right? Are we up to 4?
Oh, not yet.
Oh, did I jump right in?
Well,
sorry.
Yeah, you're jumping ahead there, Courtney. So just on page, let me just look at my pages. So page 154 to finish the section. And because we don't know much about Epicurus's own views about the cure, the therapy for love. And she says what we do have is disappointingly superficial. That's at the last paragraph. Take away looking and association and daily encounters, and the passion of love, to erotikon pathos, is undone. Well, that sounds a bit too easy, doesn't it? It sounds a bit superficial. But she quotes finally another remark that's a little more characteristic, and she thinks it's a good introduction to Lucretius's version of the therapy. By a passion for true philosophy, every disturbing and burdensome desire is undone. So one sort of eros can displace the other. A more healthy eros for philosophy can displace the unhealthy one. So I'll leave it there.
I like it where it says, Epicurus says, take away looking and association and daily encounters, and the passion of love is undone, as you said before, Judith. And I was thinking, well, that's just like saying out of sight, out of mind, which is quite true. Like if you...
And I've got
some physical distance between people, it all does cool off a bit, usually.
And I've got one sort of eros drives out the other. The cure for bad desires comes through a love of arguments that dispel illusion and leaves us with the truth. And I thought it's true. If you love arguing with your wife, eros pretty much goes out the window very quickly.
That's one way of reading it.
I bet she had some pretty big arguments. She was married to some pretty powerful men, wasn't she? Sunstein, right?
And Cass Sunstein, and who was the other one? I've forgotten who. Oh, it'll come to me.
We're up to 4. It's very short.
Do you want me to do the short one? I'll do the short one if you like. You can all do the long ones.
Go for it.
Okay, so 4. I'm looking at page 155. So Epicurus wrote harsh, abrupt prose, which was Nussbaum claims was ill-constructed compared to Plato and Aristotle. So he uses ordinary plain speech. And he also, there was a quote here, I spit on the Kalon, which was, what's the Kalon, Judith? That it's an anti-Plato sentiment. And it's
so in Plato and in Aristotle, the good, agathon, and kalon, the beautiful, are considered equivalent and kind of and part of the ideal. So yeah, it's really confrontational to say he spits on the kalon, he spits on the beautiful. It's kind of proto-cynic, isn't it? It's like that's kind of what Diogenes would do. spit on a beautiful statue just because.
Or
So,
is he inferring to the beautiful, the form of beauty? Is he trying to have a go at?
No, I think he's just rejecting conventional standards of beauty and goodness.
I see a real Nietzschean streak there, in that idea that he's it's an idol, isn't it, that he's spitting on.
Wow. So he avoided emotive poetic language and elitist language. Yeah, so he was really against poetry and elitism. But however, Lucretius chooses poetry and explains why in the poem, calling on Venus and invoking her to give a pleasing character to his words. So he uses poetry to sweeten the harsh message. Now we're moving on to 156. He's using poetry to sweeten the harsh message. His recent plan was to use poetry was for practical medical motives, and he reminds us that poetry arouses and shapes desire. So we are invited to critically examine that as an ally of legitimate pleasure, but also of empty love. So we're looking at the poetry from both sides. And on 157, the reader, the reader and the pupil that he's addressing is called Memmius, but Memmius is but we also, as the anonymous reader, we're also there, aren't we? It's not just Memmius, but Memmius is a supposed aristocratic patron, and he's also a male, and he's also an active citizen. So Mr. Joe blogs in the street, really, sort of thing, or upper class man in the street, sort of thing. Yeah, so I think that's it, isn't it? That's part 4. That's 155, 156, 157. Is there anything there to expand upon?
I don't know, just that spitting on beauty again got me thinking about Nietzsche just as I was sitting here now. And I remember him saying something in one of his books that people used to write in blood, and he said something like another generation of writers and writing itself will stink. This same kind of idea kind of gets but I don't know, it makes you think. I'm getting a bit off track, but Nietzsche is a bit weird because he's a classicist. He obviously knows this, but he's maybe he's being poetic himself, because he obviously knows that people have been writing in this way for a long, long time, and that's kind of what Epicurus is commenting on, right? Yeah. It's not new to be writing in this way that doesn't convey the spirit or the blood or whatever.
I'm happy to do section 5 if that's all right.
So hold on, I'm just wondering, like, with this what's going on with Epicurus saying he's a bad writer, but he does it intentionally because he doesn't want to be, he's like against the elites or something.
Yeah, it's kind of anti-elitist. And again, we made last time we noted that some of the cult elements of the garden kind of prefigure a lot of what would go on with Christianity. And Christianity, of course, was also like this, disregarded good Latin and Latin prose because it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the relationship with God. So yeah, it's a kind of reprioritization, I guess. So for Epicurus, what's more important is the message, not the style. But yeah, it would be a precursor.
And you think that's something to his credit, or like? Well,
it's a bit of a pose as well, right? So then you've got Lucretius, who would, and it unfortunately, because Nussbaum quotes from Lucretius, but it's always in prose. It's very hard to convey the brilliance of Lucretius's poetry, basically. So he was at the top of his game as a Roman poet, incredibly technical, but also incredibly beautiful. So, you know, when educated writers turn around and say they hate educated writing, it's usually a pose, and I'm pretty sure it was with Epicurus and with the early Christian fathers. It's a pose, it's a stance.
Interesting.
I mean, I can relate. When I write a blog post and it comes off really bad, I just tell everyone I'm being unpretentious.
That's
I'm
right.
not sure, like, I'm in the Tusculan Disputation. Cicero is having a dig at Epicurus, and he says, if you're going to read something, you should only read things that actually give you pleasure to read. And then he specifically says, unlike Epicurus, who only writes for Epicureans, and it's not even pleasurable reading. You know, no one else would choose to read Epicurus unless you're an Epicurean.
Except you, Epicureans.
So I mean, it's an interesting thing about that.
dig.
It is a good point what he's saying, like, you know, to just make something easy and accessible and non-pretentious. But then at the same time, it's like there's value in the beauty of good writing. So I don't know, I think that there's an interesting tension there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a bit of a sidebar, but it is relevant. In the Stoic community, or some elements of it, I've seen people comment that, oh, well, Marcus Aurelius really isn't a very good teacher. He's just writing for himself. Whereas, you know, today's scholars, now they really know their Stoicism, right? They're much more worth reading and much more worth learning from than Marcus Aurelius. And I'm like, okay, basically, you don't read modern scholar 9 times out of 10, and Nussbaum is the exception, right? You do not read modern scholars for the beauty of their prose. You read them to get some information and a different perspective. The beauty of somebody like Marcus Aurelius is partly in his writing. So yeah, I mean, I think there's room for a range of views about whether style or substance is more important, but usually when somebody is parading their lack of style, it's a bit of a pose, I would say.
Yeah, there can obviously be the other side where I've seen people being like, the only Stoic book we need is Meditations. Everything else should be thrown out because it's so hard to read. Like, the discourse is too hard, and like, because it's so simple and straightforward. And like, I actually think like the Meditations actually has like a lot that's going on in it.
Me too.
Philosophically. I think it's actually the simplicity and the beauty of it sort of hides how much like is actually happening with it. Yeah, it's a hard thing to balance. Like, it's
Anyway, where were we? Let's move on to section 5. So the proem, and that's where we don't come across very often. The proem, so it's like the opening section, is addressed to Venus. So that's kind of interesting that Lucretius is going to be kind of downplaying, if not debunking, in the view of scholar Diskin Clay, the role of Venus, but he still introduces her as the sponsor, if you like, because that's what a proem did. It was to introduce the god or goddess or person who was the sponsor of the poem as Venus. Just to make one sort of cultural point, well, and it's important to recognise, and Nussbaum points this out on page 158, that Venus is a neodorm genetrix. So she was not only one of the 3 main deities in the Roman pantheon, that's Jupiter, Juno, and Venus. She was particularly the ancestress of the Roman people. She was the mother of Aeneas, who was the founder of Rome. He was the Trojan hero who was the founder of Rome. So she had a particular role in Roman culture. But more generally, in Greco-Roman culture, we find in Euripides' play Hippolytus, which is a story about a young man, Hippolytus, who was the son of Theseus, the great Athenian hero. Hippolytus is a young man who rejects Aphrodite, the Greek form of Venus. So he has no time for love, he has no time for sex, he's just focused on hunting and other pursuits. Now, in that play, he comes to a very nasty end, and that's partly because the rejection of Venus, Aphrodite, love and sex was seen as somehow sacrilegious. It was not only countercultural, it was actually, if we're talking about in Plato's terms, impious. It was against the ancestral gods of the culture. So that's kind of to underline the importance of Aphrodite Venus to Greco-Roman culture. But as Nussbaum points out, there's that side, but there's also a negative side in culture, particularly with the Trojan War, to do with unlawful desire. When Helen ran off with a man who wasn't her husband, Paris, the Trojan prince, and led to a huge disaster for both the Greeks and the Trojans. So Venus, Aphrodite had that double role in culture. She was the genetrix, the ancestress, and the sponsor of culture, but she was also had this potential for absolute mayhem.
And interestingly, and it's not pointed at directly here, but I couldn't help but think of it throughout parts of this section, Freud and his eros, you remember from Civilization and its Discontent, the aggressive sexual urges sound very much like this side of Venus, this destructive mayhem causing part, but cannot be repressed, has to be sublimated in some way, can't be ignored. And in your account, it's because it would be impious, but for Freud, it would be destructive to the human psyche in some way.
And just in passing, so what page are you on here? So you're on page 159. Nussbaum takes issue with Diskin Clay's reading that Venus is going to be disappeared from the poem at this point, because as we're going to see later, she doesn't see that as the reading at all. And she says the greatest problem with Clay's book as a whole is its omission of the joyful side of life that is so much emphasized in Epicurean teachings, of the relief and delight that come when one is liberated from all religion and all stress. And here Venus is identified with that delight. So that I suppose that illustrates to us that some of these distinctions and interpretations are pretty much for specialists in ancient Epicureanism. We're probably not in a position to make those judgments, but Nussbaum has made it for us, and I think we can kind of go with that. So he starts with this beautiful passage where he describes, this is Lucretius, the beauty in nature, the waters laugh, the animals are happy, and Venus is a joyful power in this kind of portrayal. She inspires the animals with energy, and it's a beautiful scene. There's no madness, there's no cruelty, there's no obsession, and there's no murder. So on the one hand, Lucretius is situating human sexual desire in an animal context, situating us in the animal kingdom, as of course the Stoics would do as well, but also emphasizing that what is lacking in the way that animals naturally engage with each other is the kind of obsessive aspect that tends to characterize some human relationships.
Just quickly too, you know how you mentioned the Diskin Clay, and that obviously is a specialist account, but I think she does go out of her way to talk about it for us, because it's alluded to here that Clay's account is to kind of do a reading that would kind of go along a more strictly Epicurean kind of thing, as it's imagined to be, one that reduces everything to void and atoms. But she's trying to say, and in her argument, make an account that, no, it's much richer than that. It's in the preservation of pleasure. And what that means is getting to something, not reducing it at all to something as simple as atoms, but rather bringing out the human delight, bringing out that element of natural Venus or whatever, making our lives natural, which would be better than fantasies.
Yeah, it's a very nuanced and sophisticated reading, I think, that she's treating us to.
And it carries a lot more intentionality with it, you know, that we're embedded in the world with other people. You can see traces of, I know maybe this is just me, but that kind of phenomenological interest again, you know, about being in the world with other people, which fits with the social perspective. We're not just these kind of, you know, discrete beings who reduce to nothing other than atoms in a void, you know. We're part of a much more complex whole again. And there's a book by Christopher Gill on the Hellenistic self, can't remember exactly. And
The structured self.
That's the one. And it's all about how that similarity between the Stoics and the Epicureans, the holism, the holistic kind of unified cosmos kind of thing.
On page 160, there's a term she uses here, I think, called, she says he's using a deflationary argument. And I took that to mean, from how she explained it, that, you know, we have similar behavior, that there's similar behavior in animal nature as to our own. So we're trying to sort of not reducing it to atoms so much, but deflationary in the sense of bringing it back to nature. Is that how you see it? That's how we've been talking about this whole passage on nature.
That
Yeah.
When we talk about human beings, we often see ourselves as somehow different from animals and the rest of nature. We've aggrandized ourselves in some way, and so it deflates that. It brings us back down to the level of just an nature, organism.
Yeah. There was a note here too, though. I think she does say at the bottom of 160, she does say that Lucretius is quiet on violence in nature, which is a good point. You know, nature can be quite violent, really, and it's hard to ignore that. But anyway.
But this deflationary view too is something, again, that comes up in a book I read. Who was it? I can't remember. It was a commentary on Freud, and they praised Freud and Nietzsche for getting rid of God, but Freud because he made motherhood natural again, because someone was making the point that it had become like a holy thing, you know, in the kind of relationship of, you know, the Madonna to the child or whatever, but actually it was just a natural function, you know. So I don't know where I read that, but it's that deflationary thing that comes in again.
Yep. And then the stuff that you're bringing in about human social nature, Courtney, is on page 161. Sorry, Judith, you want to?
Yeah, that's okay. So on page just at the top of from going from 161 to 162, Lucretius gives a little sketch describing how in this sort of this state of nature, early humans at some imagined point in the past mated like animals. And so these people are living, as Lucretius indeed says, more ferarum, in the manner of animals. But he, you know, that's not in a negative sense, that's in a positive sense, because it lacks war, corruptions of luxury, and all
religion.
Those complications, those complications that humans tend to bring into it. But then, and this is really interesting because it kind of also ties in with the way the Stoics interpreted sort of this imagined past. Lucretius sketches the way that this leads to the development of communities, when families join together and parents have their tenderness for their children, and then that leads to a kind of community feeling. And so, and it's a bit unclear as to whether this was kind of standard Epicurean doctrine or whether this was Lucretius with his Roman twist on it. But so Nussbaum says that in Lucretius's view, these developments of community and law are necessary for a fully flourishing human life. And so that allows her to emphasize contra clay that Venus does not disappear, but she becomes civilized.
Civilized.
And so going on,
On that note, though,
yeah, sorry.
my brain is still on this psychoanalytic kind of path. Do you know, after Freud, there was a student of his called Winnicott. I think he was an English guy, and he wrote a book called the Good Enough Mother. And so you could say, like, prior to psychoanalysis, motherhood had become a holy thing. He was saying that women had inherited this kind of complex about motherhood, and like love, you could apply the same kind of demythology to it. Motherhood isn't about being perfect, this perfect receptacle for this living being. It's actually a very natural thing that happens, and all animals do it. And we could apply the same sort of critique here. And his purpose of course, from a therapeutic point of view, was similar to what Lucretius is doing. It was to get us beyond the dichotomy, like the holiness versus the unholiness, the good, and just bringing it back down to the level of you know, what do mothers do in the real world, in that embedded world of raising children without ever having any concept of perfection in mind. It's just something that just gets done, right? It's interesting.
Yeah,
because
I think we're going to be aware though, but it is, but I think we're going to be aware though, and it's quite possible that this was the case, although I don't really know with Winnicott, but you know, there's always a naturalistic fallacy element to all of this. You know, there's a fantasy element, there's an element of returning to the authentic, the original, the natural, however that's imagined to be. And so, yeah, I think this appeal to the you know, the unspoiled, pre-civilized personhood is always tempting, but always should be treated with some caution.
Totally, but what's obviously happening is it depends on the characteristics we give Venus. So if we interpret Venus as dangerous and disruptive, then we have a different kind of character. And I think it's no accident that I'm thinking like this, because clearly as we go along, when Nussbaum's thinking of medical analogy and psychic surgery and those sort of concepts, when she gets along to the Stoics in that, she's talking about some form of psychoanalysis in some regards. And this is what this is why she's such a great writer, because the theme is always there in the background. It's really clever.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on. So I'm not sure, like, whether the holiness thing, like, once that's removed, and maybe I've misunderstood your point there, Courtney, or like the point of that book you're talking about. Whether the holiness is removed, that there still is this idea of perfectionism, like going to nursing like appointments, or like I forgot what they're called, but they're basically, like, you have like the childcare nurse that you go to have like 6-month checkup or something like that. And they basically go through like what you're doing as a parent. And it does really feel like there is still that push of like, oh no, you need to be doing all these things. And it doesn't seem to be coming from a place of holiness. Yeah, so it seems like that could still be there without the holiness element.
Yeah, and I guess that's the thing, right? Even these things keep intruding. Like, people are going to still have romantic love, for example, even if they've never read a fantasy fairy tale thing in their life. Like, it's just a very available narrative that intrudes even in the most sterile of environments, probably.
So just if we can move on, maybe at the bottom of page 163, Lucretius sketches this kind of paradigm picture of Mars and Venus. So Mars is a god of war, and he's lying in Venus's arms, and he's just staring at her, and he's obsessed with, I mean, he's a divinity too, but in this case, he's obsessed with a female divinity. So that the divine woman can even distract a god. So, and just moving on to the next page, she reminds us about the fact that this distraction, to put it in a benign frame, is one thing, but the other side of it is the obsession that leads to catastrophic consequences like the Trojan War. And just as that is told in legend, in actual examples that we all know of, sexual obsession can lead to catastrophic consequences in normal life.
Just before we go into part 6, I agree with you. That's a great point there at the end there about the catastrophe. And she talks about jealousy, undermining the marriage. But further back up that page, 163, I just want to ask about this bit. Venus is, we are coming in from that idea of Venus becoming civilized, yes? And we're talking about we are creatures who produce poetry and philosophy. We have a capacity for pleasure and delight. So Venus is then portrayed as invoking, she's invoked as a colleague of his poetic enterprise. And we find lepos, animal pleasure, in words and thoughts bound up in the mind. Erotic love is as rational, both expressing and gratifying our human love of reasoning and language. Yeah. So that's sort of like a whole opposite thing, isn't it? Like absolutely to the other extreme,
Yeah, great point, Jodie. And I did mean to mention that. I just forgot. You're right. That in Nussbaum's reading here, Venus as well provides that pleasure that is so typically human in reasoning, contact, speech, words. Yeah, no, it's a brilliant depiction of her dual nature there.
Yeah, with room for tender social aspects of human life. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you guys speak about that tenderness? Because again, on my Freudian rant, nonetheless, this Venus is not complete for man and must evolve in order to involve the tenderness towards others, the concern for laws, institutions, and the common good that are essential for true human happiness. Sounds like sublimation, right? People are softened by the evolution of Venus. This is a necessary precondition of promises and contracts of community of law. Hence, in Lucretius' view, this softening is necessary for a full flourishing human life. Venus doesn't disappear from the poem, she becomes civilized. And here, I just cannot help but think of Freud, civilization and discontents. This is what I wrote about it, similar again to Freud's account, the erotic impulse is softened, sublimated by the demands of the superego, which protects us from violation of taboos and subsequent shame, which is displeasure, an Epicurean thing, and it results in civilization. Freud's account is uncomfortable because it includes religion and erotic love as unhappy compromises made to distract or anesthetize, or in other ways satisfy the aggressive erotic impulse. To me, I just see like such a complementary, it's so complementary. Anyway, enough of
Good
that.
point. Where was that from, Courtney, that piece of writing?
Oh, it's from my head.
Oh, wow. Well done.
But I remember it from Civilization.
And it's discontents. Thank you.
After all, we've read that twice, I think, haven't we?
Well, Courtney, do you want to do 6?
Okay. Lucretius's discussions are cleverly constructed so as to prepare for the attack on love. They concern perception, perceptual error, and dreaming. They're getting us to accept that not everything we see is really as it is. Our perceptual experiences may often be delusory and misleading. In particular, we are shown how our habits and habitual beliefs can distort our relationship to the objects of perception around us, even though those objects have a real character that can be correctly grasped by a healthy perceiver. The important points that Lucretius makes in his attack on Eros include, number one, perceptions are not always veridical, as in truthful. Perceptual experience should be scrutinized and criticized by the mind, attending to these possibilities of error. Only then can perception be trusted. Yeah. Number two, desire and perception influence each other. I think this is such a great point. We single out for perceiving those things which correspond to our antecedent desires and concerns. Perception is a form of attention to. It misses what it does not make the object of attention. And what we single out for attention at any time depends on a great deal else about us, especially what we wish to see. It's such an insightful observation that. Does anyone want to make a comment on that? I mean, it's something I've thought about plenty of times. I'm sure modern psychology thinks about it a lot.
These whole 5 points and the bit about animals dreaming he talks about afterwards, they're brilliant. It's really is the source of a lot of our modern thought on these things, exactly, on perceiving. It's really clear for him to have come up with this. It was so perceptive.
Well, that idea of noticing only what you know, that basically desire shapes perception. I've often thought, like reading Socrates' views, for example, that if everybody really wants to be happy and it's our concept of the good that really motivates our activity in the world, that means whatever concept of the good that we have is what's going to attract our perception in this exact way, right? So people are walking around, and this is more of a Socratic kind of way of putting it, but looking for those things in the world that line up with their view of the good. Makes a lot of sense about how people end up in dysfunctional relationships and stuff like that. It's the kind of stuff modern therapists talk about. It's just their idea of the good is completely distorted. Number three, the mind extrapolates rapidly from its perceptions, building up a whole picture from the small signs, instead of attending closely to all the perceptual evidence that is actually available. And number four, our physiological state influences desire. And through this attention and perception, when our body is in a state of depletion, we feel pain, hence desire for what will cause the end of that pain. And five, habit influences perception. Forms of habitual activity contain characteristic structures of pleasure and attention, which influence thought even at the unconscious level. An interesting argument regarding dream visions is given by Lucretius after this. If we agree that the best interpretation phenomenon is natural rather than supernatural, we will accept that given their presence in animals, dreams that is, and for reasons of consistency and economy, it should be chosen that in the human case, dreams are also explained as natural phenomena. These observations show how the mythology of love can corrupt not just the conscious, but even the unconscious life of each person. And to see this influence as a natural, not a supernatural or God-sent process, they prepare him too to understand how one might begin to counteract that influence. Yeah, it's brilliant. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, so unfortunately I don't have a poetry version of Lucretius, but I've got a prose version, and I can confirm it's very, it's just amazing. It's so comprehensive, and she's right that he directs his arguments so carefully towards these different points. It's really extraordinary, the depth of his analysis.
We're at 7 if you guys want to do, who's ready to read 7? Are we going to finish with this one? We're still going well for time.
Well, I can belt through 7. I'd rather do 7 than the later ones. They're a bit full on. They're beyond me, but I can start with 7 and throw it over to you guys for the rest.
Go for it.
All right, so 7. From dreaming, he develops the idea of love as illusion with a natural psychophysiological basis, and dreaming he sees as delusion, satisfaction of which takes a delusional, inappropriate form. So he talks about these three types of dreams. He talks about, you know, because if these situations happened in waking life, there would be shame, but in a dream state. So one is the thirsty man who dreams of gulping water because he's thirsty. I mean, we've all done that. A person who wets the bed, you know, well, you know, it does happen to people. And then, of course, you know, a young teenage boy is given the exact example of a wet dream, really, hasn't he? So, so the dream that causes these things. So throughout the dream passage, Lucretius tells Memmius to be subservient to his guidance, adopting so he's saying to Memmius that he is in charge here. He's sort of showing himself to be in charge. He's subservient. Memmius should be subservient to his guidance, and he adopts an authoritative tone. So then he turns from this idea of the dream state into waking sexual life. And Nussbaum says it like this, that Memmius is moved to center stage or to the middle of the operating theatre, is how she puts it, or surgical argument. And then he gives a straightforward description, a complex interaction between physiology and psychology and sexual longing and physical impulse, produced by an accumulation of seed. And this is also seen as not just male but female, because it says in the notes at the bottom they actually believed in female seed as well. So this idea of a build-up of seed and drawn out by the attractive force of another human being. So it's mental as well as physical. The desire to perform, So this is what our Venus is. This is a quote from Lucretius. This is what our Venus is. It is a form. It is from this, however, that we get the name of love. So this is how our idea of love is invented, from these experiences, these types of experiences of arousal. Arousal, I've written veridical relation to the object, not from false belief. So he's saying this isn't a false belief. This is actually a trip, like it's actually real, and it's a natural process. So it's not false belief that this is is the origin. It's not, doesn't originate in false belief. It's actually a natural phenomenon. That's on page 168. We're going to page 169. And just briefly, I'll just say here about Clay. So if she brings up Clay again as having the reductionist view at this point. So Clay is claiming that Venus is no longer anthropomorphized, that Venus is basically a movement of atoms, that Lucretius wants to deflate the romantic ideas and reduce them to a crudely physical idea, whereas Nussbaum says, no, she sees it more as a psychological phenomenon. So page 170, Nussbaum claims that Lucretius is committed to erotic intentionality, which you brought up before, Courtney. So this idea of intentionality. Desire always has a human object. And she's a Venus of intentionality, and she does not disappear, says Nussbaum. So in book 5, we move to the tenderness in marriage. For example, there's a passage on mutual desire. But she does feel here, she's saying that Clay is on the right track with the physical, psychological language used here. But what is missing, Nussbaum feels, is that idea of the exaltation of the love object into a kind of deity, or the object as being an object of obsession and worship. So what page, then moving into page 171, I'll stop then and you can have a think about all that.
But more than
171,
that, oh, sorry, you're continuing. Yeah.
I'll just finish this 171 and then we'll go back. The people in this approved description on page 171, this is the original natural Venus, where we get the name of love. Then the transition, yeah.
Sorry, that bit just before there's an
Yeah.
important thing,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
The exaltation of the object of love into a kind of deity and an object of obsession and worship, the aim to become one with the object. That's the important bit. The thought that love is something godlike or God-sent, something in and through which we transcend humanity, because that becomes part of the next chapter, is that this is why we do it. That was Ashley's question, like, why would we do it? Because even though people get rid of religion, they still wish to transcend their humanity, and they do that through the love object. They try to seek union with this Venus deity, and that's what makes the whole sexual experience painful and awkward, because it's an impossibility and it's an absurd project to actually have with another person.
The way she puts it is the transition is from a form of sexual behavior to the conventional form of anxious and unhappy love. And we need to move from one to the other. And here Lucretius moves into a critical examination of it. So that's what opens up where we're going in section 8. Yeah, so you're right. It's all about that movement into the painful aspects.
I'll just add, if I may, in the final paragraph on page 171, just to comment on the Latin. So she gives the Latin phrase, haec Venus est nobis, and also hinc autemst nomen amoris. And finally, hinc illaec primum veneris dulcedenis in cor. So in all those three sentences, haec, hinc illaec, those all have a bit of an offhand connotation. It's like, you know, that's what Venus is all about. You know, it's kind of, it is, I'm afraid it is actually reductionist in the terminology there. That's what Lucretius was definitely being a bit reductionist with his language there. So to support Clay's interpretation, that's what's coming across to me in the Latin. Because I think he seems to be at least trying to show the origin of this massive superstructure of romantic love is of a rather you know, shaky basis. So yeah, just make that point about the Latin.
So can anyone elaborate on the female seed? What's going on with that?
Yeah, I don't know, because I didn't know they had that idea back then.
Well, notoriously, Aristotle thought that the female was only the receptacle of seed. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure whether the Epicurean theory was a bit different. But yeah, it could possibly be in this, or maybe in the next book of Lucretius.
Do you think they would have just chopped up a woman and found like eggs in her ovum thing, you know, whatever, ovaries? Oh, look, she's got seeds in her.
They're microscopic, Courtney, so that
you wouldn't see them.
That had to wait till the 1660s.
Fair enough. There you go. I'm a man. I don't know anything about this stuff. All right. I tend to immortalize the women in my life, so turn them into goddesses, you know, and then have very dysfunctional relationships with them. My go-to. Are we at?
I do it in reverse.
You like to be the object of affection.
No, I deify the men.
Oh,
man.
okay. Again, this language is very Freudian too. This love object and object of affection, that's all very Freudian. Okay. Number 8. In the following section, Lucretius gives more information about the difference between love, the sick or bad form of sexual interaction, and the more natural and fruitful form that he recommends. The bad form is obsessively focused on a single person, religiously attentive to that person's form and even name, tormented by an anxiety that eats away at the lover like an ulcerous sore. It is a madness that grows day by day. For the person who avoids this love, there is available a pure form of sexual pleasure that is not marred by these pains. Just ask Shannon. What are these lovers trying to do? They do not know what they are trying to do. This is the interesting bit. Their passion fluctuates in unsure wanderings. It is no wonder that they cannot decide, for the aim they're pursuing is absurd. Unlike the natural human lover who seeks pleasure, in fact, mutual pleasure, the person in love seeks something far odder. They seek union or fusion with the object of desire. This is the origin of the intensity of these lovers' efforts, the explanation of their frenzied biting and grasping. But this aim cannot be achieved because the person never can be taken in. And I didn't write this bit down, but in the text, there's all these suggestions about trying to nibble off a little bit and things like that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Lovers must feed themselves on perceptions and on these alone. The separateness of the other, the fact that contact is possible only through perception by responding to perceptible signs, all this is not delight to these lovers, but a painful frustration of their dearest wish, which is to eat the other sexually, feeding on that other mind and body and having it completely. That's at 174. Why goes love? Why did I put that? It should be, why does love want to devour this person? This one and no other? It's a good question. Because this person is seen to be perfect, divine, the only one, the one he has to have. And you know, that's really interesting because as a young man, when I was growing up, there was someone like that in my life. And yeah, it had to be that one. That was the one that I had to have. And I've talked about this to other men. And because I got her, I was successful in this attempt to get her attention. It really changed my early life experience, I think. I've often thought that the universe is listening to me because it gave me what I wanted, you know, against all odds. I've talked to other men and they've often said they've had those deified kind of encounters with women that they've wanted, but have never got them. And it's deeply hurt their self-esteem in some ways. In a lot of cases, men have told me about that they've doubted their efficacy, if you like, to get what they want, to get the object of their desire. And in fact, some of them, where it really affects them, doubt their ability to get what they want in the future. I think there's something quite deep and psychological going on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it sounds very true.
All right.
Yeah,
It's interesting though. It's such a common thing, and yet Lucretius' ideas are so radical, isn't it? Like, isn't it? I don't know. Like, I think there's something there about like I think the force of that, the power of that desire. I think it's so much more than just popular culture instilling beliefs.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I'd be tempted to agree with you.
Because I mean, it's like the culture says you should be rich and prestigious and all that kind of thing, and yet most people don't feel like their power in the world is, because they don't feel like they're lacking in the world because they haven't become rich yet. They just kind of think, it'd be nice. Oh, well, too bad. But yeah, seeing if they can't get their lover of choice, they, feel like their whole life will be wretched now. But it's so, I don't know, so interesting.
Yeah, and maybe you're right. Maybe it doesn't necessarily, it's a chicken and egg kind of thing, isn't it? Maybe it doesn't start with poetry, but maybe a man has this excessive feeling, or maybe it's a woman as well, but the man has an excessive erotic impulse that isn't satisfied, and somehow he then expresses it into words. It becomes poetry, and it becomes like a bit like those zombie movies where, you know, I think there was one where there's a, you remember The Ring? They make a video and anyone who watches the video gets sick. The same idea, like he's now infected the page with his yearnings, and other young men who are open to such infections read that, and their kind of seed of feeling like that suddenly is given life in the imagination and takes off, you know, that kind of idea. Does that make sense?
Isn't there, like, you know, if we talk about the psychoanalytic perspective, isn't there something to it that, like, there's a certain character type or a certain personality that becomes so obsessed with this romance or the beloved, or, you know, finding their beloved or something like that, and it's, you know, people that are kind of you know, like have a schism in their personality that they project onto someone else as being something that can unify and make them whole, or something like that.
Well, that theme of unity and that is exactly what they're talking about, to transcend the world, to, there's something unsettling about being a mortal human, or I don't know, maybe it's that idea that the pain comes with it. I think Freud talks about it, right? He says the baby has the oceanic experience in the beginning. It feels unified with the mother figure, and for the rest of its life, there's something missing. And so it looks for that unity, that oceanic experience in the caress of a lover or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. It's interesting. Yeah. Anyway.
Because, like, Eric Fromm talks a lot about this, where, you know, because they're saying that, yeah, we have the problem of being, you know, alienated and separated, but then, you know, he says that, like, a sort of genuine love is one of the best solutions to it, but this thing of, like, idolizing the lover is a kind of like a cheap escape that people can use. So, yeah, I don't know. We're not going to talk about automatons, but yeah, I don't know. There's something. I think there's something more going on with all of this.
It's a very interesting topic. We better run ahead.
But,
sorry, you finish.
Oh, like, well, I don't know. Like, if you know, if that thing of a transcendence, if it's like, you know, if the reason why, like, romance is so popular now is, like, when people have such a lack of that sense of, you know, great, and like being a part of something greater, or that, you know, spiritual sense, or something like that, or that sense of, like, connectedness and relatedness. People don't have that with the broader world, so they're just, you know, just try and shoot it right onto one person and get a big fix of it out of one person.
I can't help feeling that maybe, is it possible that it's part of our instinct, our animal instinct, to have these amazingly strong, overwhelming desires of this type? It might even be in our very DNA, you know, like it's in our inherited biology. I don't know. It's possible. But then it does move on. I know you want to move on, Courtney, because time's running away. But then then shit gets weird. It goes south. You know, like it really starts to fall apart. You know, if we keep going, because we get into this whole thing of it just becoming a disaster. Really, go on, hurry up. It's a good story.
Well, I just want to comment on page 175. There's a very famous passage that Nussbaum quotes at length about the way that men idealize the different characteristics of the women in their lives, the women they're obsessed with, they put the best possible spin on it, and they're not trying to do it. It just comes out that way. So a black woman is called honey-skinned. An unwashed and smelly woman is called unadorned, akosmos, or sort of like natural, and so on. It's such brilliant psychological observation that people do this sort of super characterization of the person they're obsessed with. It's brilliant stuff, yet again, from our friend Lucretius.
I love that if she is dumb, she is modest.
Yeah, there's, and it's kind of, I mean, the thing is, it's kind of endearing the way that men do this about the women they love. I mean, there's an absolutely endearing aspect to it that, I mean, obviously, as a woman, I appreciate it. I appreciate that faculty of men to make the best of whatever of whatever features that their woman has. It's endearing, it's positive, and I love it. But it's also, as Nussbaum and Lucretius indicate, a cliche.
And it also, that segues back into where we're up to. Even though it's endearing, it also has bad consequences. And let's not this kind of makes us think that it's always bad. And some people just manage to have good romantic love anyway, you know what I mean? Like this, but you can see this definitely is the case for people who get carried away. Like there's plenty of domestic violence cases, for example, where this might apply. So maybe it's not as bad as Lucretius is making out for everybody, but she's trying to say that the bad consequences, as enumerated by Lucretius, are two sorts. One's external and the other's internal. The external bad consequence is a waste of strength and force, loss of control over the rest of one's life, damage to fortune, damage to political activity, damage to reputation. The internal consequences are more striking. This is what he's really concerned with: love's possessive aim and its inevitable frustration. And from that point of view of Epicureanism being aimed at ataraxia, it's the frustration that's really the issue here, because deeply psychologically, the urge to unite with a figure that is impossible to actually achieve that with just produces this kind of deeply felt kind of frustration. And she says that these the frustration produces three pernicious consequences, described scathingly by Lucretius. First, these lovers suffer from a continuous sense of frustration and non-fulfillment. That's what we were just talking about. This is an inevitable result of the impossibility of their project. Two, to the frustration caused by the impossibility of possession, Lucretius now adds the closely allied frustration of jealousy, of a world that stabs like a weapon and lives burning like a fire in the heart. Damn, I can't tell if that should be lives or lives. Like a weapon, and lives burning like a fire in the heart of glances at others, or hidden smiles that remind the lover of his incomplete possession. These torments, as well as the simpler frustrations, arise from the lover's aim, which does not tolerate the other person's separate life. The aim to possess is not good for the other person either. It leads to suspicious, anxious behavior that can hardly be either pleasant or just to its object. It does not foster a disinterested concern for the object's good. The lover's obsessive focusing on his own aim and on the meaning of each casual remark or smile or glance for the status of that aim is not conducive even to a correct perception of the loved one's actual properties, much less to conduct that seeks the good of the other so qualified. The other disappears almost entirely, becoming merely a vehicle for the lover's personal wish, and at the same time, a permanent obstacle to its fulfillment. Even in the intimacy of intercourse, the real life of the other is ignored in the lover's frantic pursuit of this aim of union. The partner is punished, in effect, for her very otherness, for resisting an incorporation that would remove love's bondage. Love's desires are not only just painful for both lover and beloved, they are also self-defeating. Any harmony and union that might be expressed is thwarted by jealousy and an increasingly agonized sense of non-possession, and to an increasing opposition between lover and beloved. She really went on about that, and I thought it was interesting, so I kept writing. But the third pernicious result is such a lover armed with such aims and obsessed with the overestimation of the loved one that is a part of that project will prove unable to tolerate the evidence of the woman's everyday bodily existence. And now this is really interesting, isn't it? Because it introduces that we've got obsession on the one hand, now we're getting to the idea of disgust. And so the poor human woman must strain to give the lover what he wants, even if it means concealing herself. But once revealed, the lover may move from worship to ridicule, and from obsession to scorn and disgust, from the ritual of adoration, which is in that story that I've skipped through, to a flight from bad odors. Can we mention that story? Because I thought that really interesting. When I first read it, I laughed because I imagined the woman was on the toilet doing a poo-poo, but apparently that's not the case at all.
Well, it's about 7 or 8 reasons, you know. It just made me want to go and have a really long hot shower.
And it's kind of this brings out the real, the real classicist in Nussbaum, because she wants to get to the bottom of this this interpretive problem about what the problem is with the women here, and she goes through. So on page 179, she refers to Houseman. Now that's A.E. Houseman, the great English poet, who also happened to be this phenomenal classicist, but who gave his analysis, because it dealt with kind of, these sensitive matters in Latin, of course. And so some of the more remarkable interpretations are ridiculed by Houseman in a learned note, whose sexual frankness is inseparable from its elegant Latinity. Now, those of us who love our Latin totally love that. But anyway, what did Houseman come up with? He doubted the interpretation that from this Lachmann, some other, learned German, I guess, that the lover was able to detect from the particular scent that the woman had sex with someone else. But Houseman doubted that in his interpretation. So we're left with something that has to be typical of just women. Basically, it has to be something to do that afflicts only women. It's not, and that would rule out your interpretation, Courtney, of being on the toilet. And so Nussbaum settles on, plausibly enough, I would say, the smells associated with the menstrual period.
But there's an even more interesting one there given about a special device that you use to blow some sort of powder on your vagina because it stinks.
Fumigation treatment for gynecological complaints using sulfur, urine, and feces, or
But contra Brown, as we find on the next page, Brown does not have any cogent argument that se suffit must have the technical medical sense. He admits that in one other occurrence in Lucretius, it does not. This is Nussbaum, really hitting our straps as a classicist. And his evidence for the practices in question is mostly Greek rather than Roman. Still, if we accept his view, the basic point is close to the one I find: something about the way the female body typically works, once inspected, produces male disgust.
And that, the classic misogyny, against, anyway.
Yeah.
And it's quite good, this section, like what Nussbaum's presenting. Like, she's going through, like, this is what someone thinks, this is why it's rejected, this is what someone else thinks. Like, there's a really good flow, and she's like put it like a good amount of pages towards it. I just sort of quickly scanning.
That's what classicists do, Shannon.
Yeah.
All the time.
No, look, this is like, it's just such a good way to present the argument. Like, even though she's coming to she has like her perspective on it. It gives you like flags like, oh, if you want to look into this, like, these are the people who are arguing about it. It's yeah, it's a really good section. At least like just quickly scanning over it.
And just quickly moving us aside, forward from the bad odors, we're told this is not the end of the therapy. The poet moves us beyond disgust to a new attitude. Lucretius has forced us to reflect on the oppositions contained within the story, and I'm really intrigued by this idea of oppositions. He invites us to see that these opposites depend on one another. If there is no illusion, there's no moment of disillusionment. If there's no glamorous onstage show, there's no backstage that looks by contrast mean and poor. If the loved one is not turned into a goddess, there is no surprise and no disgust at her humanity. The really cured state would not be the state of the disgusted lover. It would be a condition beyond both obsession and disgust, in which the lover could see the beloved clearly as a separate and a fully human being, accurately take note of the good properties she actually does possess, and accept both her humanity and his own. Love's fantasies constrain and enclose both men and women, dooming the former to an exhausting alternation between worship and hatred, the other to a frantic effort of concealment and theatre, accompanied by an equal hatred of everyday human things. Very good.
Mm.
And that's that importance, again, going back to that Nietzschean kind of idea, his view that criticism of one pole of an opposition should end by freeing us altogether from our adherence to the polarities themselves and the view of the world they construct. And that involves Nietzsche's kind of critique of morality in some ways.
So just to move on, I think she's right to say on page 184 that and on her interpretation of Lucretian therapy, that the arguments are impressive, and she identifies Lucretius here as foregrounding female pleasure, and we might think that was a discovery in the 1960s, but that's not the case if we read Lucretius sensitively. And she says he's taking a leading role in this tradition, anticipating later arguments about human things and human limits. And so finally, I think, and I'm just on page 185 here, according to Nussbaum at any rate, he concludes around the community aspect, that marriage, raising children, is promoting the ends of community, requiring, as she says, stability and tenderness. It means that partners have to appreciate and accept each other's daily backstage life without disgust or boredom.
Yeah.
To make delight of the everyday.
That's right. The goal of Lucretian therapy is to make a good marriage possible. And that's, totally around his very Roman reading of this tradition. Sorry, I think Ashley's put a big quote in the chat. I'm just going to look at that.
Read it out loud.
Excreting is the curse that threatens madness, because it shows man his abject finitude, his physicalness, the likely unreality of his hopes and dreams. But even more immediately, it represents man's utter bafflement at the sheer nonsense of creation. To fashion the sublime miracle of the human face, the mysterium tremendum of radiant feminine beauty, the veritable goddesses that beautiful women are, to bring this out of nothing, out of the void, and make it shine in noonday, to take such a miracle and put miracles again within it, deep in the mystery of eyes that peer out, the eye that gave even the dry Darwin a chill, to do this and to combine it with an anus that shits, it is too much. Nature mocks us and poets live in torture. Impressive.
Who wrote that?
That's Ernest Becker in The Denial of Death.
Oh.
On the favorite quote.
On a on a similar theme, just a funny little anecdote. I know we're running out of time, but just quickly, I was in the prison today, the women's prison, talking about the complete rejection of the goddess. I was trying to teach a cognitive behavioral therapy class where they were going to take a situation and then apply an alternative kind of set of thoughts and beliefs to some situation they come up with. And this woman said, well, the other day, one of the girls shit in the shower and she put her underpants over it. And then this fierce discussion began in the class trying to work out who did it and why did they put their underpants over the shit in the middle of the shower. And the girls had worked out, I don't know what they had to do with CBT, but they worked out that whoever did it put their underpants over the shit as a prank because somebody who would clean up the underpants would pick up the underpants and get shit on themselves. And I had to listen to all this and basically sit there with a group of women who were yelling at each other about someone having a shit in the shower. And finally they agreed, this was kind of sophisticated analysis, that someone must have done it as a prank, thinking it would be funny for someone to pick it up and get shit on themselves. But when they saw the reaction of the other women in the shower being very angry, they decided to cover up and become shameful and not admit that it was them, in fact, who did the shit in the shower in the first place. Anyway, talk about total things that a man shouldn't know about the other.
Isn't it? Like anything can be an opportunity for learning, right? Like you're right. You know, Socrates in the streets, CBT in the shit shower prank. You can learn anywhere. It's truly wonderful.
That's prison for you. Oh, we're nearly at the end then. The ending of the book is seen by many as boring, as an anticlimax. We are told that a woman who is ordinary can still be loved and not by divine interference. You just get used to her and learn the value of her deeds, her efforts, the habits of sharing daily life with her. The poet leaves us with a question. Does habit affect desire in just the way that water wears away a rock? Interesting. The naturalistic image is lacking in poetic appeal. The reader of love poetry demands a dramatic or moving end and gets none. As readers, we begin to become aware of our own problematic relationship to our everyday life and its routines, including its routines of affection and concern. We begin to see the way interest in these daily repeated patterns is undercut by romantic longing and by the poetic language in which that is so frequently expressed and taught. And she says she will return to this topic later. The procedure of presenting multiple perspectives and comparing opposites without arousing or instilling the emotions he criticizes gives Lucretius' method considerable dialectical power. Lucretius offers a perspective that differs somewhat from Epicurus. The inclusion of the social perspective gives new concern for social connections and institutions like marriage and children, which seem to serve political ends that move beyond the limits of the garden. Furthermore, this new attachment to marriage and the family leads Lucretius to defend as valuable a way of life that does not seem to be the one best suited for individual ataraxia, since it includes many risks and possibilities for loss and grief. That's pretty much close to the end. Do you guys want to do a quick sum up? I mean, there's one little section left. Who wants to do that one?
Judith, do you want to do it? I can do it if you
like.
like.
No, I'm happy to do it. I mean, section 10 is quite short. So Nussbaum asked the question, well, how good are these arguments? Lucretius argues that the central aim of people in love is that they're seeking some kind of union or fusion with the beloved. And that has some kind of intuitive appeal, I guess. But this kind of union is neither necessary nor sufficient, even if achievable. It's not sufficient because even if a lover could, per impossibile, take his lover's body and mind into himself, that would be precisely not to respond to them as hers. So the act of union would negate the division between the two, or division of the two people. So what can we find that these Lucretian positions are plausible? And she dwells at some length on this issue of selfishness, or even sadism in sexuality, and the fact that well, so she thinks, at least, that Lucretia sees human beings, perhaps especially males, as being needy and wishing to punish the source of their incompleteness. Maybe she's going a little far there. She argues that Lucretius is diagnosing some kind of pathology in a lot of relationships. And again, in her interpretation, that he's diagnosed problems in the failure to take account of what the female in the relationship actually wants. But she is right, I think, to conclude on page 190, there remains something disturbing about Lucretius's account. The poem insists that with the removal of illusion, all the mystery, wonder, and more than daily excitement of Eros must go. And so, yeah, what are we missing when we've sort of divided through for that? In other words, Lucretius fails to ask whether there might not be intense excitement and beauty precisely in being needy and vulnerable before a person whom one loves. And she refers in the passage to Plato, which of course is key. She mentions the Phaedrus, but I think we could also mention the Symposium as one of the key discussions in Plato of love and need. So she goes on to suggest at the end of the page that the people he criticizes, this is Lucretius, people he criticizes are doomed in love by their obsession with completeness and control. But cured Epicureans still cling to these goals. They may not insist on controlling and immobilizing their erotic partners, but this is not because they've actually learned to be humanly incomplete and needy without resentment. It is, I think, because they have become internally godlike in the Epicurean way, with no deep needs from the world or from one another. What neither the sick patient nor the cured pupil have found, it seems, is a way in which being simply human can be a source of erotic joy. So to conclude, Nussbaum reminds us of the great Western tradition, as she points out, from John Donne through Emily Bronte and beyond, which has focused on passion and love, erotic excitement and wonder. Lucretius, she says, cannot understand this joy, for in the end he is an Epicurean, and as an Epicurean he cannot permit himself beyond a certain point to follow his own advice to yield to human life. He does not yield. He demands the life of a self-sufficient God. He says, quote, I've gotten in ahead of you, O Tuque, and I've built up my fortifications against all your stealthy attacks, unquote. Is this the attitude of a cured lover, or is it simply a new form of the disease that Lucretius therapy was supposed to cure? What a great end, right? Yeah. What an absolute tour de force.
Yeah.
Such a great book. What do you think, Shannon? Your eyes aren't bleeding today?
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think like I say, it just feels I can definitely appreciate that there absolutely are people like that. That there definitely are men like that. There's probably more people I talk about relationships. But it's not for myself personally. It's not what I've experienced to that level. To when I see the way other guys behave, like just like another thing, like I remember I was talking to someone at work and they were saying like how they were going to music festivals. And they were like, yeah, I'm going there. And like to sort of summarize what the conversation was, he's like, yeah, I'm going there. I don't like the music. I'm just going there for the girls. And to me, that just didn't make any sense. I'm like, but I don't like the music. So why would I go there? Like, I don't want to meet anyone who likes that music. I don't care. Like, they're just like this like like there's just that level of obsession that I see in other men that exists, and I don't mean like sexual. It's just like like a neediness and like I don't know. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's true. It's there, and I mean, this is something that we could talk about in a whole lot of different contexts, but just very quickly, we're in an epidemic of family and domestic violence, and a lot of the time there's an obsessive man who's convinced that, you know, his former partner is seeing someone else, or his current partner is seeing someone else, or simply that he hasn't spoken to her in, you know, in an hour or something, and he's got to talk to her. There's a lot of that around there, you know, and unfortunately it often, you know, does play out in absolute tragedy in one way or another. And so I think on that level we can take seriously the Epicurean and to some extent Stoic warning against obsessive passions, because they obviously and you know, in our daily lives and lead to these horrendous results. So yeah, it's not theoretical. For many men and many relationships, it's absolutely present in daily life. This obsession factor.
I was intrigued to, you know, to see that link that was being drawn by Lucretius and by Nussbaum, really, that, you know, that idea of, you know, in cultures where men are meant to be strong and self-sufficient, that they would then suffer at the fact that they find themselves in a feeling of neediness, and they find it difficult to be needy, and therefore punish the source of their weakness or their incompleteness. And the proof, you know, and then goes on, you know, to talk about all the dreadful things that happen, you know, that we all know about, you know, that happen in society, all sorts of dreadful things that can happen against women. And I, you know, I have thought, wow, fancy that this whole thing, is it possible that it's linked back to this one phenomenon? You know, incredible, you know, it's thoughtful.
Actually, I mean, I think we should be equally concerned about parents who have the same attitude to their kids. Like, I remember when I worked in childcare, there was this little girl, and she just used to, like, as soon as her parents left, she would start like pulling hair on the other kids and just like doing all kinds of horrible things, bashing the other kids and stuff. And then the parents would go, "Oh no, no, that wasn't my little princess. She would never do that. You're thinking of another child. She's an angel. She never does. She's perfect. She'd never hurt a fly." And so and then just kids just growing up rotten, like, you know, like, I think that is just as
disturbing,
prevalent as this obsessional romantic love is people worshipping their children.
Yeah, we have all these myths around us, and I think that's where you could look at Winnicott and think about motherhood or raising children or all other different kinds of targets that we definitely mythologize. But I was going to say,
well, school teachers as well, they're saying like now you can't punish kids because parents will be yelling down your throat about how their kids were perfect and don't deserve to be punished, and they're being abused by the teacher, and like all this kind of nonsense now is like just getting completely out of hand.
Yeah, well, that's another big topic. But just quickly, I just wanted to comment on what you guys were saying about obsession and that. One thing that really strikes me about what Nussbaum's saying too is what's on the other side of obsession and disgust. And I think that's why she was trying to offer a different approach than what Disc and Clay was offering, was the idea of this intentionality that we have in our desire for one another, that when we have desire, it's not about nothing, it's about another human being. And if we could have clear and correct perceptions about that, we'd be living in the real world, and the real world would be one in which really good human relationships would be possible. And I like that kind of other side that she's pointing at across the barrier of these polarities between, you know, disillusionment and deification, for example. I think that's really striking.
And it's interesting that even the nature of his poetry towards the end of the piece, not that I read it, but she claims that how it becomes quite average. There's the beauty of the poetry is diminished as well. Like it's a deliberate move towards the commonplace or the boring, that is meant to be our best aim. In an Epicurean marriage, she says it would be boring. It would be without effect. And you think, oh, really? But her defence, though, to put forward her own views on a more healthy relationship is very welcome. He seems to be aiming more at the pathology of love. Where love is actually an illness or a harmful thing.
Well, that was a big topic, guys. We've done really well. We've gone half an hour over, but thank you again. You guys put in so much work, and I know that there was a lot of work involved in it because it took me hours to write those notes. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
I thought
everyone.
you had your chapter already. I thought you had your chapters already written, Courtney, from
Not all
last
of them.
time. Oh,
No,
okay.
some of them.
Oh, it took me ages, but I definitely put in my legwork.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
you.
See you at the next
Yeah.
one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
See ya.